The independent chair of the inquiry into the Sheffield street tree dispute. Thank you for joining us again. Let me apologise to all of you that we're running a little bit late for this discussion than we originally intended, because my previous attendee had a lot of important things to say to us which I wanted to make sure we had time to listen to. So can I please thank you for coming and ask you if you could tell us your name and your role.
Good morning, my name is Peter Anderson and I'm the Managing Director of Amey's Transport Infrastructure Business.
Thank you very much indeed for coming, and we'll talk a bit more about your role and how long you've been doing it in a minute. But firstly, I just want to run through a couple of points with you that I run through with everybody. Firstly, I really appreciate your coming to talk to me today, and you'll tell us in a minute how long you've been with the business and the base on which you're talking to us.
Yeah.
I want to make sure you understand that we are live streaming this and it'll be recorded and then published, and you're okay with that?
I am fine, yeah.
And also that you understand that we have to be careful in these sessions that we don't inadvertently say anything that's defamatory or libelous, and if I worry we're heading into that territory, I'll let you know, and if we can't resolve the problem in extremis, we would have to curtail the hearing. I'm absolutely not expecting to be in that position, but that's something I say to everybody, so I mention it to you as well.
Okay.
Good. Let me firstly thank you very much indeed for coming for the discussion. I also want to thank you, and if you would pass this on to your colleagues, I would be very grateful, for the fact that Amey have given me a lot of very valuable information for my inquiry, and people have worked very hard, I know, in preparing that information, and we will draw on it in our discussion. I just want to record my appreciation
thank you.
For that. And I would like, just so everybody understands, to ask you first if you'd like to make some introductory remarks, including on the question, if you like, on your own role in Amey and for how long you've been discharging it, and the basis, therefore, on which you're talking to me today.
Thanks, Mark. So, as I said, my name is Peter Anderson. I'm the Managing Director of Amey's Transport Infrastructure Business. I'm a chartered civil engineer by background. I have 30 years' experience in the infrastructure industry, and I've held the role of Managing Director for Amey's Transport Infrastructure Business, which includes Amey LG Limited, for the last 2 years, having previously held senior leadership roles in other major contracting organisations. I welcome the opportunity to represent Amey at today's hearing, and although I wasn't at Amey during the height of the tree dispute, I will answer your questions as fully as I am able to by others. I've consulted with others, and you have other representatives from Amey taking part in the hearing as well, and they'll be more familiar perhaps with some of the detail as they were here at the time. Some of the issues that we will likely talk about are quite complex, so if you'll forgive me, I may refer to notes as I answer some of your questions. In terms of an opening statement, I would just like to record that Amey is very proud of the work that we've done and are doing in Sheffield. Our contract covers more than street trees and includes the renewal and maintenance services to pavements, highway servicing, grass cutting, litter collection, street cleansing and LED street lights. In collaboration with Sheffield City Council, we've transformed the quality of the highway network infrastructure over the last 10 years and will continue to do so during the lifetime of this contract. KPIs show that the satisfaction in Sheffield's roads has more than doubled since 2012, though we recognise that there is still more work to do. Amey is a major employer in Sheffield with over 500 Amey people working across the Streets Ahead contract and also in other offices across the city. And the Trees campaign affected many of them personally. Throughout, our employees on the ground tried to maintain good and constructive relationships with the campaigners and to engage local people on the works that we were doing and the positive benefits that they would bring. We recognise this was an issue that some people were extremely passionate about. To a degree that was not foreseen when the original contract was put together. However, we should not forget that this was a tree replacement programme, not a tree felling programme. And we are putting back far more trees than were removed to ensure a sustainable tree population for Sheffield over the longer term. I think that we've all learned lessons, and we welcome the more collaborative approach to decision making on the issue that has been introduced with the Street Tree Partnership.
Thank you very much indeed. You made a number of very important points there, which I'm grateful for you flagging at the beginning. One or two of them we'll come back to, but I do appreciate the fact that you've put those things on the table from the outset. So just so everybody understands, you've been with Amey for a couple of years. You're briefed for today's discussion, and you're aware of the documentation that your team have worked so hard to give to me. So that's the base on which we're proceeding. But everyone needs to understand you weren't here for much of the most contentious period, and that limits the effect. That limits what you can say, possibly. Everyone needs to understand that. So the first thing I'd like to ask you to just tell us a little bit more about, because it's important we maximise wide understanding of this, is the division of roles between Amey, the contractor doing the work, if you like, and Amey Hallam Highways, which is the special purpose vehicle set up as part of the programme. And if you could just explain that to us all, please, including sort of the main facts of the financial structure of the contract and how the finances of the contract work.
Yeah, of course. So the contractual relationship between Sheffield City Council, the client, Amey Hallam Highways Limited, as you say, a special purpose vehicle, or SPV, as we would refer to it, was established specifically for this contract. And Amey LG Limited, they come under my portfolio of businesses, is the organisation responsible for the delivery of the majority of the services. And that's a normal PFI structure adopted across the industry. So Sheffield City Council entered into a project agreement with the SPV for the works and services relating to the rehabilitation, the maintenance, the management and the operation of highways, of the highway street scene. In turn, the SPV enters into a subcontract arrangement with Amey LG Limited to deliver those services on its behalf. There's a straight pass-through of the obligations from Sheffield to the SPV and then on to Amey as the delivery organisation. Those obligations and requirements are set out in the project agreement that is put in place between the SPV and Amey's highway business. And that's operated under what is called an operating subcontract agreement. So it's a formal agreement between the two parties. As is the case with any PFI project, the risk associated with the delivery of the services is transferred to the party best placed to manage those risks. And in this instance, the majority of the risks for delivering the Streets Ahead programme passed through the SPV to Amey LG. The PFI contract is relatively complex and has a complex payment mechanism, as you'll appreciate. And this one was no different to other PFI contracts that Amey have entered into in the past. From the outset, the SPV takes out significant loans from lenders, which are used for the capital investment during what we call the core investment period, or the CIP. Those loans are paid off via a unitary charge from the authority paid down to the SPV. That unitary charge is also used by the SPV to pay Amey, who physically undertake the works. So that's the kind of flow of the capital through the contract. That payment is made through a monthly service charge, and part of that service charge is to enable a build-up of what we call a life cycle investment fund.
Yes.
So a portion of that unitary charge goes to a life cycle fund that is used following the core investment period to maintain the assets across the city of Sheffield in accordance with the standards achieved when we exit the core investment period. In this contract, the authority, Sheffield City Council, has over 752 performance requirements, which they use to measure performance across the contract. If Amey LG fail to achieve the required performance standards, significant deductions can be taken from the unitary charge. This can cause cash flow problems for both the SPV and ALG, and problems of the SPV ultimately with their lenders who are funding certainly the early investment period of the delivery. That's why contracts such as this are monitored and governed extremely tightly. The governance structure for the relationships between Sheffield City Council, the SPV and ALG are no different to other PFI contracts that I have experience of and Amey have experienced. And that monthly reporting cycle of the performance of the contracts is pretty standard.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. That, if you don't mind me saying so, that's one of the clearest explanations I think we've heard of the structure. And as we'll come on to, it has a number of consequences and implications. I want to ask you a question about the finance of the SPV in particular, which was an additional topic we provided a week or so ago in the light of some other things that arose we wanted to ask about after the first list of topics we sent you. I believe I'm right in saying that Amey is a shareholder in the SPV, yes, and that you nominate a person who's a director of the SPV. So this is information that I'm guessing it's reasonable to expect that you have. So as you know, a deficit's been recorded in the accounts of the SPV since about 2017. And I want to ask you about the implications of that and how you expect any issues arising from that to be addressed in the remainder of the contract.
So the role of Amey LG is to forecast very carefully and considerately on an annual basis the investment required to maintain the standard of the asset. So we've still got some 15 years to run on the PFI contract. So the role of Amey is to forecast annual budgets for spend across the street scene assets and forecast ultimately what that outturn investment will need to be, and then those conversations are had with the SPV about sums available through the unitary charge that I talked about earlier on, and one would work towards the conclusion and ultimate handback of the street scene assets back to Sheffield City Council on the termination of the contract in an acceptable state and delivered with the remaining funds that are available in the life cycle fund that I referred to. That's my understanding of the model. In terms of more detailed questions around the financing of the SPV, that's something that you should probably take up with the SPV organisation themselves, which we can facilitate. But I would say Amey is a minority shareholder now in the SPV. As we've moved out of the initial investment period, as often is the case with organisations such as Amey's, we move out of that investment period because the bulk of our control of the outcome has been discharged through that initial construction period.
Okay. Well, we have put questions to the SPV, and depending on the response, we may take you up on your offer to facilitate comprehensive answers to those questions. Thank you very much indeed. I wanted next to ask you to say a little bit more about the essentially the relationship between Amey, the contractor delivering the work, Amey Hallam Highways as the SPV, and the council, and the sort of governance structures and the lines of communication. If you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay. So in terms of the relationship between the parties, so we have a contract with the SPV. Yeah. So we would have within the Amey LG organisation, we have a management structure, as you'd expect, which reports on a monthly basis the performance of the contract at the Amey LG level, where we get visibility of the work that's been planned and the work that's delivered, the safety performance of the contract, any issues that have arisen in terms of the delivery of the obligations under the contract. So we would do that within the Amey organisation, and there's a management structure and a meeting regime that you'd expect. So we have an account manager on the contract. He reports into an operations director, so that would be his line manager. So there would be a sort of day-to-day coordination and feedback at that level. Then I have a sector director for the highways business. He will oversee on a monthly basis a deeper dive into the contract performance of the contract, and I would do that similarly on a monthly basis in a slightly shorter, higher level discussion. In addition to that, we have board meetings with the SPV, so we are in monthly contact with the SPV, and as you said, Amey being a shareholder in the SPV, we have a seat at that table as well. So very close communication and contact between Amey and the SPV, and then similarly a similar sort of monthly rhythm with the clients. So we'll be meeting ultimately with Sheffield City Council through Amey's delivery team on the ground, and that's weekly, fortnightly, daily if necessary, communications around programs of work, traffic management, the impact of the works that we're doing and the maintenance works on the city, reviewing performance around the 752 metrics I referred to. So that's a regular dialogue, and then I have regular meetings with leaders of the council in terms of directors of place and highways, and our chief executive has a reasonably open dialogue with the chief executive of Sheffield City Council. So at all levels, Mark, and on a regular sort of monthly rhythm, there's very good communication between Amey and the SPV, and then ultimately between Amey, the SPV, and Sheffield.
Very good. And would it be fair to say, in summary terms, that while the formal contractual relationship is between the council and the SPV, as a practical matter, a lot of the communication and dialogue, a high proportion of the communication and dialogue, is between the council and Amey, the contractor?
Yes, it would be fair to say that. Notwithstanding that fact, we have an obligation to the SPV as Amey to keep them informed, which we do through the various forums that we have. And of course, any meetings that we have, that Amey has with Sheffield Council, the SPV are invited to, and very often send a representative to those discussions. So I would agree. There's a lot of communication between the ultimate client, Sheffield City Council, and the delivery team on the ground, which is the Amey LG team. Yes. And
there are some meetings that are basically that the SPV might not be at for one reason or another, but if something significant changes or needs to be reflected in updating the agreement, then by definition the SPV have to be involved in that.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. The next thing I want to ask you, please, to say a little bit more about than you've said before, although you helpfully touched on it in your introductory remarks, is what the Streets Ahead programme has achieved to date in the first 10 years of its operation.
As no doubt you're aware, due to the financial constraints, Mark, during the 90s and the noughties, Sheffield's highways had been neglected quite significantly. It had fallen into a state of disrepair, needing significant investment. The Streets Ahead project was therefore a very big deal for the city, with the focus being on improving the quality of the road and pedestrian ways. We were and are proud of the Streets Ahead project and delivering the total street scene service as it does of renewal and maintenance across the highway infrastructure. As I believe other stakeholders have said to the inquiry, the state of the highways from before the contract to now is incomparable in a very, very positive way. The Streets Ahead programme has transformed the city street scene network. The programme had an intense period of activity during the CIP period, the first 5 years of the contract, where there was a focus on getting the highways up to the required standard. And that was a contractual standard and a contractual obligation to achieve that in the first 5 years. That represented a very visible improvement to the street scene in Sheffield, and that's then maintained in the subsequent period throughout the remaining term. The life cycle of 20 years. During the CIP, project milestones were achieved and signed off in early 2018. The scope and scale of the activity going on across the city was huge. Amey had 752 performance requirements to meet each month, in addition to the significant capital investment works that were going on. So it was about far more than tree replacement. Some examples of what our team have achieved: 755 miles of road resurfaced, 123 traffic signal sites upgraded, 1,500 miles of footway resurfaced across the city, over 232 public road shows held to inform the public and engage and communicate with the public about the works that were coming up. Satisfaction condition of the road surface up to 65%, a significant improvement on the historic position, and over 326 improvements to bridges and 326 bridges and structures improved. So a significant piece of work. I could go on. 65,000 new LED streetlights, low carbon streetlights installed across the city, and 1.5 million leaflets and letters dropped to residents, informing residents of the works in their area. So a huge amount of construction work, improvement work, and a significant engagement with the local population.
Okay, so that's very good and clear, and thank you for the information. And a lot of what you've just said relates to the inputs and outputs, if you like. But I wonder if you'd like to describe for us your understanding of the benefits to the city, the residents of the city, businesses, the neighbouring community, of upgrading the infrastructure in the way that you've done through the project so far.
Well, you'll have been told that the reference to Pothole City and that real degraded nature of the infrastructure in Sheffield before the PFI contract. So that transformation is all about uplifting the brand that is the city of Sheffield, improving the outlook for the residents, of course, but also for visitors and businesses coming into the city. A number of significant events annually in the calendar of Sheffield attracts a huge number of visitors to the city. And it's Amey are hugely proud of what's been created with Sheffield City Council in terms of a very positive outlook to the street scene, cleaner streets, less graffiti, fewer cracked pavements. These are all measures that are used by the council to demonstrate significant improvements in the street scene, and of course improvements in health and safety and well-being as a result of improved street lighting, fewer potholes, damage to vehicles and damage to cyclists. It is significantly reduced, as is slips and trips and falls on pavements, as one improves the quality of that pavement network. Clearer signage, improved traffic signals to improve the flow of traffic around the city, increased uses of the integration of the bus network with the car network, and giving priority to buses. So Amey have worked tirelessly in support of the council to improve the logistics of how effectively and efficiently the city flows during peak times, and of course integrating all of that service with the Sheffield Metro system as well is important. So a real integrated transport solution of significantly higher quality.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Now, you're also aware that some issues have arisen as well, which is why we're having the inquiry, and a dispute arose. And so I want to get into some of those issues with you now. And the first question I'd like to ask you to address is what you think, with the benefit of hindsight, and you weren't here at the time, so you can speak with the benefit of hindsight, and no doubt your colleagues will have offered you ideas on this, what you think Amey might have done differently in the design stage, the years before which the contract was signed.
Okay, so the first point I would make is you're right, I wasn't here, but I have consulted extensively with colleagues. So the first point to make is that Amey is very experienced in PFI contracts, in the delivery of highway and street scene works, the design, the development and the commissioning of street scene improvements. So Amey comes to this from a position of real expertise and experience. Having said that, there are a number of lessons with hindsight, I think, that we can all learn, but in particular, I'll be taking away to improve our organisation. And if I can just touch on a few of those, one of the key challenges that Amey faced was the lack of flexibility in the specification for the contract.
Right.
I mean, you'll understand, because I've set out the PFI model, how restrictive it is, how the demands of central government have to be met by the contractual terms, by the risk apportionment, and by the KPI monitoring and measurement of performance to effectively deliver the commitments that Sheffield made when it applied for PFI funding from Treasury. So a very tight set of contractual requirements. So I think, Mark, somehow in that mechanism, building in a little more flexibility, I think would be helpful. And as a sort of a prelude into the nub of the issue here and the trees challenge, more flexibility around the approach to the trees and the management of that tree stock during the design phase, I think would have better prepared us all in terms of the work to be delivered, the selection of the areas of work to be delivered, the prioritisation of trees, and the way that the tree stock was to be dealt with throughout the contract. So I think greater flexibility. We all went down a path that we probably wouldn't choose to go down in the future, and I think having greater flexibility in the specification, I think, would help. So that's a lesson. I think the other lesson we'll take away is the community engagement. So as I'm sure you've heard, Sheffield City Council led on the communications. It was very important that they were seen to lead that communication. Whilst Amey would have had community stewards on the ground, I think having Amey involved to a greater extent in a more coordinated and collaborative comms machine, I think would have helped. Amey could have explained, the rationale for the tree programme, the benefits of the tree programme, the criteria by which trees were selected for removal, and how rigorous and diligenced that process was. I think would have been another valuable lesson. So I think greater flexibility in the specification, but we understand why those restrictions were imposed, and I think perhaps wider and more engagement in the comms, Mark, from Amey would have been helpful.
Okay. Am I right in understanding that Amey did not expect in 2012, when you signed the contract, that a dispute would emerge?
So there's a clause in the contract, clause 19, which puts the obligation of managing protesters on Amey LG. During the tender stage, that clause was reviewed as part of the tender process, and because there was an existing programme of tree removal in Sheffield without replacement, is my understanding, before the start of the PFI, our assessment of that clause and the requirement for Amey to deal with protesters was more around national protests that one might expect to see on the streets around conflict zones going on around the world, and more political protest, Mark, than actually protesting about the core delivery of some of the street scene services. So our assessment was, because there was an existing tree removal programme in place that was going on without incident, our assumption was that under clause 19 we would be happy to accept the responsibility of dealing with protesters, because we felt that they would come from national political protests, be an inconvenience to the works but not significantly impact on the works. In no way did we anticipate the level of passion and interest and commitment of the tree campaigners to protect the trees in Sheffield, and didn't in any way price or programme or foresee that level of management of that issue.
Right, so you didn't expect what emerged. And
No.
So my next question is, do you have any thoughts on what might have been done differently when you were developing your thinking about your bid for the project, which might have exposed the risk of problems emerging? Could you have asked different people different questions?
I think, putting into context the bid period, Mark, a very competitive environment, we're pitching for a significant opportunity to secure over £2 billion worth of contract in the PFI space, which Amey had significant experience of. The engagement during that tender phase is pretty controlled, because the council needs to make sure that it's a fair and equitable process. So there's limited opportunity to engage. A number of managers on the bid were from the Sheffield area, so there was experience of the street scene environment, and at no time did anything raise its head that was of any concern. And I wouldn't expect that, Mark, to be honest, because there wasn't any. Emotions weren't running highly at the time. We had visibility of an ongoing tree clearing activity that Sheffield were undertaking in their own right. There was no indication of protester action during those events. So there was nothing that came on our radar, and I wasn't there, but I can appreciate the environment that they were in. No, I would say there was nothing that would have preempted or forewarned us about that. Certainly nothing forthcoming in the tender documents anyway.
Would it surprise you to learn then that people, including people from trade unions, local business leaders, middle management staff in the council, have told me that they flagged, including to Amey, as back in 2012 and earlier, that the approach being set out for street trees was going to be problematic?
Yeah, it would, yeah.
You would be surprised to learn that?
Yeah, I haven't got that. I've got no insight into that, Mark, in any of the conversations I've had. I might be wrong, so please, there are other representatives from Amey that you'll be speaking to, so I'm sure you'll ask them, but
yes,
I'm not aware of that preemptive information that might have led to a problem. Okay,
very good. Thank you very much indeed. That's clear. I want to come on now to the issue of the rationale for the proposal that you included in basically your final set of offers to the council in mid-2012, to include in the contract the provision to remove and replace 17,500 mature street trees, notwithstanding the fact actually that the council had recently said to you, why don't we reduce the size of the tree replacement programme to 8,750? Could you just explain to us the rationale for that?
Of course, yeah. So my understanding is that prior to the Streets Ahead contract, the tree stock was in a phase of long-term decline in Sheffield. The street trees were over mature, with many trees being unsuitable for use in the street scene because of their age in the main, and not appropriate for the long-term maintenance of the highways and the footways. And there were also, as I understand it, Mark, many tree species that were not suited to an urban environment. In its 2008 business case to the Department of Transport, Sheffield City Council identified, as you say, that 75% of its tree stock was over mature and required replacement. It's also important to note that more trees were removed and replaced. The more trees were removed and replaced, the more it cost Amey. So there's no incentive for Amey whatsoever to increase the number of trees. We were not paid more for removing and replacing more trees.
Right.
My understanding from discussions with colleagues who were involved in the bidding process is that originally the draft output specification included within the bid documentation provided by Sheffield City Council in 2009 included a requirement to remove and replace, as you say, 17,500 trees, which was 50% of the tree stock. Prior to the final bid stage, Sheffield City Council were pushed, I understand, by central government to reduce the cost of the project. One of the number of ways that they looked to do this was to reduce their requirement for the removal and replacement of trees from 50% of the stock to 25% in 2011. So the output specification finally came out with that confirmation. This was simply a cost-saving exercise by Sheffield City Council under pressure from central government. My understanding is that when it came to Amey submitting their final tender, bearing in mind they're in competition with Carillion, it was at the time.
Yeah.
We were aware that Sheffield City Council was very concerned about the nature of its tree stock and the long-term damage it could have to the highway network. On that basis, as part of our final tender winning strategy, Amey decided to offer Sheffield City Council what they originally wanted in the 2009 version of the output specification, i.e. back to the 17,500 trees at no extra cost.
Right.
So that was a final negotiating pitch by Amey to secure that capability. Another important point is that the 17,500 figure was used to develop the bid valuation process and the budget. It was not the driver for the agricultural teams in the delivery post-award. Trees were identified for replacement on the basis of the tree condition survey and a walk and build process which highlighted the extent of infrastructure damage and the risk of third-party claims. My understanding is that it was not envisaged that Amey would reach the 17,500 figure unless there was an unexpected issue, for example, a disease such as ash dieback, which might require an exceptional number of tree removal. That figure provided the council with reassurance that they wouldn't be carrying the risk, that risk of occurring additional cost for unplanned emergencies would be borne by Amey.
Okay. I want to just get into a little bit more detail on this from the documents that you've given me, and we can give you the bits of the documentation I particularly want to ask you about, just in case you don't have it in front of you. But there's a couple of specific questions on the method statement that was part of the contract and that you attached to the documentation you've given to me. So Lucy will give you a couple. Okay. Give you this now. And I know you haven't had a chance to look at this in detail, but I don't think for what I want to ask that's necessary. Yes, the two flagged things I want to ask Mr. Anderson about. So firstly, if you wouldn't mind please turning to page 15 of the method statement, which is flagged. There's a picture of a tree in the middle of it. So the paragraph 6.5.39 says quite clearly, I think, and I'm asking you to just tell me whether it's unreasonable for me to think this. It says the service provider, i.e. Amey, will replace 50%, 17,500, of the highway tree stock throughout the 25-year term period. Is that a fair description of what it said? Yeah. Now, the next subparagraph, 6.5.40, very helpfully actually sets out what I take to be the rationale for this this proposal, which, as you've said, isn't quite what the council said in its final spec, and you've just described to me why you came back with the original. And it's the rationale that I want to make sure we understand. So 6.5.40 says the service provider confirms it selected this option for a number of reasons as described below. The first reason given there is that this will lead to a significant reduction in damage by highway trees to the infrastructure. That's a fair understanding of what's said here?
Yeah.
Very good. The third bullet point then goes on to say this choice will also reduce highway tree maintenance costs. Is that a fair description of what's...
Yes. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I want now to turn to something else that caught my eye on page 18 of this document. I think the page should be flagged in your copy there as well. This is a table which sets out the places in the city in which the tree replacement program will take place. And as you, I think, can see, for the purposes of describing what will happen where, your method statement, the company's method statement, divides the city up into 7 areas. Southeast, south, southwest, central, north, northeast and east. Now, my reading of this table is that the part of the city in which the largest number of trees would be replaced was the southwest of the city. 21% of the replacement would take place in the southwest of the city, as is said in the column in bold at the top of the table.
Yes, I see that, yeah.
It's also the case that nearly 30% of the overall replacement would take place in the first 5 years of the programme. 5,007 trees would be replaced, replanted in the first 5 years, and 17,500 over the 25 years. So it was heavily front-loaded.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you whether it's reasonable for me to draw the conclusion that the implication of this was that the southwest of the city would see a larger tree replacement programme than other parts of the city, and it would be heavily front-loaded. Would that be a fair... And therefore the street tree scene in the southwest of the city would be particularly affected by the programme?
I think the only caveat I would put, Mark, on the 2 questions you've asked me, both the first point around the service provider will replace 50%, 17,500 trees. That's a commitment in the tender submission.
Mm-hmm.
That means that the contractor has made provision in their price to remove up to 17,500 trees.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the contractor is absolutely duty bound to do that. The contractor will work with Sheffield in identifying the trees to be removed, and will work with Sheffield and the local communities to remove those trees.
Right.
That's a reaffirmation to the client that we have priced to remove up to 17,500 trees. If there's more trees to be removed, there would have to be a discussion with the client about the recovery of the cost for more. So it's a line in the sand, Mark. It's not a firm commitment.
Right.
And similarly as well, you'll appreciate at tender stage, our teams have got a lot of data that they're trying to assimilate, and we have to portray a picture to the client in order to win the bid. We have to portray a picture of confidence in the task ahead and the scale of the task ahead.
Right. So
what the team I think here have tried to do is apportion the 17,500 trees, which is not a commitment to remove 17,500. It's a commitment that we've priced to remove that.
Yeah.
The ultimate number will be determined through the 25 years of the contract.
Yes.
Ultimately, the indications of the regions of Sheffield where trees are to be removed are our best estimate, given the data that we have at the time.
Yeah.
And the purpose of the early design period is to reaffirm some of those assumptions and And as I said, the walk and build and the identification of each tree in turn, jointly with the council, to identify those trees to be removed in order to improve the quality of the pavement and the highway.
Yeah.
You'll appreciate the roots of these trees infringe on the carriageway, infringe on the footways, making it difficult for people to pass. And I'm sure you've seen a number of sites. So those were the drivers,
yes.
And this table is simply a commitment to what a programme might look like.
Right.
Were Amey to be successful in the contract.
Okay. As it happens, though, this turned out to be quite a good forecast of what.
Okay.
The point I wanted to draw attention to was that there was no part of the city more affected by the tree replacement programme than the southwest. That is something I take from the way that
I'm seeing this
I
for the
understand.
first time. So
looking
at the
very
numbers,
fair point.
that would be a fair assumption.
Yes,
but
okay.
I have no information on what has actually happened, Mark, and what the sort of tree count to date is in any of these areas of the city.
No, I understand. The point I'm getting at really was there appears in this piece of paper to be an expectation that in that part of the city, that would be how things would
and I presume that's come from our interrogation of the tree report that was included in the tender documents, and we'll have made assumptions from that document about the numbers of trees in the different areas of the city, and we will also formulate our plans, albeit at tender stage, of how we go about delivering that programme of work.
Yes.
In order to manage our resources, manage the impact on the residents of the city. And Darren Butter, who you're speaking to later, I'm sure will be able to talk in much more detail about how that work was programmed and how those numbers were defined in the tender.
So that's fine. I completely understand and recognise you weren't here at the time, so there's a limit. But I'm just trying to make sure I'm not misunderstanding what's going on in this table, and I will ask other people about it.
Yeah, but please understand, it is absolutely not a commitment to remove 17,500 trees. And I've inquired how many trees. We're nowhere near that number, Mark.
Although, as it happened in the first 5 years, you got rather close to or beyond the number here.
Okay.
Now, the reason I dwell on this point is just to check whether it would surprise you to find out that most of the dispute gained its visible manifestation in the southwest of the city. You don't find that surprising, or you do find that surprising?
I'm not familiar, Mark, with the regions of the city, so I'm really not best placed to comment
can't
on
that. That's absolutely fine. Thank you very much indeed. That's extremely helpful. Now, I want to move on to ask you if you could just describe for us what you understand to be the way the operational managers on Streets Ahead briefed and interacted with your predecessors on the Amey executive team and board.
Yeah. Okay, so standard process for reporting within Amey is communication and formal reporting on a monthly basis, Mark, as I indicated earlier on. That happens through the business in a predefined and a predetermined way. So it's quite common. That way, key issues are escalated as appropriate up through the organisation. This is how reporting is done within Amey. It's done within many other businesses, in my experience, in the same way, and that was the way that I understand it was done at the time in question. On a day-to-day basis for operational matters, the operational managers liaise and report to our operations directors in Amey, which I mentioned earlier. As appropriate, operational issues are escalated and were escalated to the business director, who was responsible for the delivery of the contract. So information relating to operational progress, issues on the project would flow up through the Amey hierarchy from business director to sector business director, up to the managing director, my role, if you like, and then ultimately, as necessary, on to the chief executive of Amey, should relevant issues need that level of escalation. So issues would also flow through the monthly service operations updates, the management boards, strategic boards associated with this particular contract, which included senior representation from ALG, from the SPV and from Sheffield City Council. So a great deal of scrutiny from senior leadership and, if I will say, a well-informed and well-engaged senior leadership team within the organisation of Amey. I understand that the tree protests started to escalate. Our CEO was briefed ahead of meetings that he would have with Sheffield City Council on an ad hoc basis, and CEO briefings became increasingly frequent as there were further escalations in process. Amey took the situation very seriously, and the Amey executive was particularly concerned about the safety of Amey staff,
yes,
and the wider public on the ground. So very, very clear and concise and informed communication.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Could you, in order just to illustrate the way that Amey board level people and senior management were drawn in, just describe for us the reaction of board and senior management when they learned what had happened on Rustlings Road in November 2016.
So as I've said, I wasn't with Amey at the time, Mark. However, Amey's governance structures are very similar now as they were at the time, and I'm certain that the matter would have received the appropriate level of scrutiny at all levels of the Sheffield contract, within the highways business, and then at the Amey group executive level. The delivery of the operation would have been devised at an operational level within Amey LG and in full collaboration with Sheffield City Council, with Sheffield Council very much in control of the decision making at the time. However, it's important to note that after the event we would have been very concerned by the feedback that we received on that particular issue from our client. My understanding is that the initial feedback from Sheffield officers leading the operation was that it was a successful and safe operation, which we were thanked for in terms of its delivery, and that would have been fed back to the Amey executive. I understand that following the Rustlings Road event, the negative media coverage relating to the programme was raised at Amey executive level, and that our then chief executive met with Nick Clegg, the MP for Sheffield Hallam at the time, to discuss the situation.
Is there anything more you'd like to tell me about that conversation?
You should speak to our then chief executive, Andy Miller. I think
I'm talking to next week
with
yes.
Andy.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
But I am aware that the meeting went ahead.
Yes.
But I don't know the details.
You haven't seen a record of the outcome or anything. Okay. Thank you. Is there anything else that you are able to tell me about the advice provided by Amey staff to your then chief executive for his discussions between, well, in 2017-2018 with combination of the then leader of the council, the relevant cabinet member, who was Councillor Lodge, and with the then chief executive, who was John Mothersole? Is there anything more you can tell me about those discussions from the material you've been given?
Yeah. So our chief executive would be well briefed. I'd be certain of that. So he would receive a formal written briefing ahead of those meetings. He may well have followed that briefing up with phone calls or even meetings with operational individuals on the contract, just to get the latest updates. As a chief executive, one always wants to be as informed as the client representative is at those meetings about what's going on the ground. So that would be very important, to prepare well for those meetings for sure. There were a number of meetings between our then Chief Executive and Sheffield City Council's Chief Executive, and a written briefing would be provided ahead of each meeting, and these happened numerous times between 2017 and 2018, and they would have discussed, I'm sure, in those meetings the tree situation. My understanding is that throughout, the Chief Executive and the board of Amey were provided with all the factual information that they needed from a decision-making perspective, and this would include, indeed, legal advice from internal and external lawyers when necessary.
Okay. In other evidence you've given to me, the company has said that you faced local political pressure to remove as many of the remaining trees as possible, and that pressure increased as time passed, and that regular meetings were held with the political leadership of the council where that position was regularly emphasised. So I just wonder if there's anything in the briefing you've been given which speaks to or illustrates the nature of that pressure.
I think my understanding of the situation is the penalties that I talked about, the KPI obligations on Amey for the quality of the street scene, for curb lines, for highway integrity, are measured, they're assessed. The impact of the trees was known on the infrastructure, and Amey were monitored and measured on their ability to deal with the tree ingress on the carriageway and repair the carriageways and footways and curbways, and indeed were monitored on that. So at the time there was significant pressure, I think, brought to bear on Amey to drive forward with the tree replacement programme in the interest of safety, so dealing with diseased and dying trees, unsafe trees, renewing the stock, minimising the damage on the infrastructure, for which there would be penalties potentially levied if that work wasn't progressed. So yes, I think a significant amount of pressure put on the Amey teams, many of whom were from Sheffield, lived in Sheffield and worked in Sheffield. So yeah, difficult time for everybody.
Yeah. Compared to other contracts you've had a degree of oversight responsibility for, from what you've been told, do you think the level of pressure applied was unusual, or was the kind of thing you would expect?
I would expect from time to time robust conversations. There is a significant pressure to improve the standard of the infrastructure. Amey are committed to do that, and contractually obliged to do that with the SPV. The SPV as an organisation is relying on the financial metrics of the contract to work. In order for that to work, they rely on Amey to deliver, and they pass down the contractual risk to ensure that Amey does deliver. So that's usual in a PFI environment, and those sorts of robust discussions around performance and around the need to significantly increase the quality of the street scene, I can understand at the time were common. Mark, they're still going on now. Mm-hmm. You know, we're still in contract. We're maintaining through the life cycle period. And the contract from time to time comes under significant pressure. So that's not new, and that's just the nature of contracting, actually. But in particular, for reasons I referred to earlier, the very tight control around the metrics, because it's a PFI. Okay. And there are government credits that flow down to Sheffield that then flow down to the SPV. So, yeah, there is a lot of focus on performance.
Okay. Well, I'll pursue this issue a bit more, perhaps with one or two other people's, but thank you for telling me what you've been told on it. How would you summarise, from what you've been told, the concerns of Amey's senior management during the dispute, and how they were engaged in finding a solution.
Yeah, I wasn't there at the time, as I've said. Andy Milner, I'm sure will be able to better answer that question, Mark, that I am. But I know from discussing the matter with Andy and with colleagues that primary concern of Amey senior management would have been the safety of Amey staff, above all else. So maintaining the physical safety of Amey staff during the works, but also ensuring that their welfare is looked after and their mental health they're supported through what was very challenging times for a number of my team at the time. So that would be always of paramount importance. Senior managers from across the business unit were involved in finding solutions and supporting the operational delivery teams. It was given the appropriate level of scrutiny, I think, at senior management level in Amey Highways, and indeed at the group level, Mark, with multidisciplinary teams supporting the contract from the centre as well. The managing director of the Highways business at the time sat on the board and was a conduit for escalating information regarding the proposed solutions. Conversations were taking place at all levels of the project, whether it be CEO level, the monthly service operations meetings, management boards, strategic boards. The contract was receiving a great deal of scrutiny from Amey.
Okay. As you know, I'm sure you'll have been briefed on this, the measures taken to try to essentially force through the implementation of the programme escalated through 2017 and early 2018. More legal measures taken, the introduction of stewards, the hiring of security personnel, the use of what was described as reasonable force. I wonder if you could tell us what view Amey senior executives and the board took of those escalating measures, including what alternatives, if you've been briefed on this, they asked to be considered.
Okay. I think just in terms of context, Mark, it's important to remember the context within which these decisions were made, and in fact the escalation was seen. We were contractually obliged to deliver the project. And we couldn't just stop delivering the trees programme because protesters were making life difficult. I'm sure if Sheffield City Council had told us we could stop, then we would have. But at the time, we were put under significant pressure to continue with the programme of work because we had contractual obligations to deliver improved quality of the street scenes. We were required to do more to try and deliver on our contractual obligations, and Sheffield were paying for us to transform the infrastructure. They'd made that commitment through the PFA contract, and they wanted to see the continuation of their highway network transformation. So tremendous pressure to continue with the work. My understanding is that the decision to use reasonable force was very much a last resort decision following a number of escalatory measures and pressure from the client to continue with the work.
Yes.
A very difficult decision for Amey, one that it took very carefully and very deliberately. It took internal and external legal advice.
Yes.
It consulted with South Yorkshire Police at the time. It consulted heavily with the client, Sheffield City Council. The SPV were also engaged in those discussions, but escalations coupled with the need to continue to progress the works meant that unfortunately we had to escalate to hiring security and as you say, resort to reasonable force to preserve the programme and continue the progress.
Is there anything in the briefing you've received which speaks to the question of whether Amey thought those measures would be successful in hindering or deterring the campaigners and protesters?
I think Amey's view this thing escalated, Mark, over a period of time, and I think Amey would have thought their priority is to protect the health and safety of their workforce, their contractors delivering the works, but also importantly to protect the campaigners in their actions and keep them safe at all times. So I think Amey would have thought reluctantly, perhaps we can continue, perhaps we can, under reasonable force, protect the workforce, segregate the areas of the streets where we needed to do the tree work and carry out that work in a safe and professional manner. That would have been the intent, I'm sure, of Amey at the time.
Okay.
And would have hoped that one or two incidents of that level of security intervention would pave the way for continued progress.
Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned just then that you referred just then to consultations with South Yorkshire Police. Are you aware of a letter that your legal advisors wrote to South Yorkshire Police on the 8th of December in 2017?
I am, yes.
Are you aware of why that letter was written? What was the purpose of that letter?
I think the purpose of the letter was to understand South Yorkshire Police's position and really try and engage South Yorkshire Police in enabling Amey to further carry out their work. And there were a number of legal cases at the time which you'll be familiar with, and that letter was a request really of South Yorkshire Police to understand South Yorkshire Police's view of Amey taking a stance worthy to proceed with a reasonable force stance, just to reassure Amey that was seen as an acceptable escalation by South Yorkshire Police. And really it was a plea to engage with South Yorkshire Police to support Amey and the client to protect the work site, uphold the rule of the law, and progress with the tree work.
Okay. I have been told that that letter arose partly or largely as a result of pressure put by the council on Amey. Have you been told that?
That's my understanding, yes. Right.
So that was an example of significant pressure being put on the company by. That would be a fair way to summarise your.
That's my understanding.
That's your understanding.
Please
Very
check
good.
with others from Amey, Mark, but that's my understanding. That was the case. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now you said just now that the purpose of this letter was to establish the views of South Yorkshire Police and I think to understand what. I think if I've understood you, the purpose of the letter was to understand what you were entitled to do in terms of use of reasonable force. Have I understood that right, or would you like to just say again for me what the purpose of the letter was from your point of view?
So the purpose of the letter was really threefold, I think. The first one is to seek further and additional direct support from South Yorkshire Police. My understanding at the time was that whilst South Yorkshire Police were present, which was hugely appreciated by the Amey team on the ground, they were not active in dealing with the campaigners on the ground as we understood it, and that's my understanding of the situation. I wasn't there, but that's my understanding. So the first point was to try and garner their support for managing the situation. Right. The second one was to get clear understanding from them that reasonable force was an acceptable escalation for them. Right. So that Amey was not going to fall foul of the law if indeed it escalated to the use of reasonable force. Right. So it was to open up a dialogue about how we manage that situation to make sure that our workforce are protected, as I said earlier, make sure the residents and indeed the campaigners are protected. So that was the second purpose. And I think the third one is as you've said, in response to pressure brought on by Sheffield City Council to engage with South Yorkshire Police directly. So Amey took legal advice in drafting that letter. You've obviously seen the letter, and that was the reason why that letter was sent to South Yorkshire.
Okay, so it's basically a response to, it was a way of managing the pressure you were under from, that was one of the purposes, it was a way of managing the pressure you were under from the council.
Yeah.
So is it, I'm just wondering how to interpret the assertion in the letter that Amey believes that South Yorkshire Police are acting unlawfully in breach of their obligations in the way they were policing the activities. Is that best understood as something on the first purpose you described, that assertion that South Yorkshire Police were acting unlawfully?
I think on reflection, Mark, I think the tone of the letter is you've got to understand the context, and the pressure that everybody's under at the time. I think on reflection, the tone is probably quite assertive from Amey in the letter. I've read the letter, and I think on reflection, I think it was a response to the pressure that Amey found themselves under. I don't think it would be a normal letter
right.
for Amey to write to any police force under any circumstances. So I would say it's an unusual letter. Having read it, the tone of it is unusual for Amey, but I think it was just a demonstration of the tremendous pressure that I think the Amey team felt that they were under at the time.
Yes, I understand. Thank you very much indeed for clarifying that. Now, we've sort of touched on this already, but I just want to ask if there's anything else you can tell me on the topic of the guidance the senior executive provided to your senior Streets Ahead staff, Mr. Butt and others, in seeking to develop negotiated solutions. Because in the written evidence, the invaluable written evidence you've sent me, it is stated that Amey tried to promote different solutions during the course of 2017, or from early 2017, or if not before that, to the ones that were adopted. And I just wonder if you could explain the role of the senior executive, insofar as you understand it, in guiding the development of those alternative solutions.
Sure. So my understanding, having spoken with members of the team, Mark, who were involved, is that while senior executives were fully informed and kept informed as the situation developed, the management of the situation on the ground was very much led by the contract delivery team. That being said, the senior executive team within Amey were fully supportive of the team on the ground developing alternative solutions, and those were developed between our operational expertise on the ground. You'll speak to Darren later. Darren Butt will tell you about, I'm sure, more about the detail of what was in some of those alternative proposals. They were supported by our commercial managers, because please remember we're in a contract.
Yes.
We've got obligations under the contract. I understand at the time Sheffield were very reluctant to invest any further funds in the contract, and some of the alternatives, the engineering solution alternatives which Amey put forward, would inevitably incur additional costs. So under significant pressure, I think those alternatives at the time were less attractive, I think, to the client because of the need for additional investment. But I understand that the responsibility for developing those solutions was delegated by the senior executive of Amey down to the senior management team within the contract, and that is right and proper. I would expect to see that. Those teams on the ground had the expertise and the skill set to adopt those alternatives. Amey executive would have viewed this as a project with key issues to resolve. It would delegate the authority and responsibility to resolve those issues to the operational level, and it would support that team on the ground with senior level intervention and dialogue at CEO level in order to push through potential alternative solutions. So I'm sure the Amey leadership team were fully supportive of the team on the ground.
Okay, thank you. It was also the case that this dispute attracted the attention of the then Environment Secretary and the then Secretary of State for Housing Communities and Local Government in 2017, and there was that interest was visible to Amey. So I wonder if you could tell us anything about the view the senior executive and the board took of the interest from the top of the national political level, witnessed by that, including any reflections you have on the effect the dispute was having on Amey's reputation.
Okay, so the Amey board would be very concerned about the senior governmental interest in the contract. In terms of engagement, I understand that there was a meeting between Michael Gove and Andy Milner. Andy will be better placed to speak to you on the specifics of that discussion. We don't have a record of the specific reflections of that meeting, but Andy will be, as I said, better placed to answer that. We know that the street issue was considered by the Amey PLC board. That's the highest level of governance within Amey in the UK. So certainly it was on their agenda for their discussions. It had an appropriate level of scrutiny. I'm confident at all executive levels within Amey. In terms of the impact on Amey's reputation, engaging with such senior members of central government, there were obviously concerns around that aspect. During the heightened protests, Amey brought dedicated communications professionals onto the contract team to help manage that messaging and that liaison with Sheffield City Council. Because ultimately Amey had no authority and no mandate to communicate with residents or otherwise without Sheffield City Council's approval, then that was very difficult for us to manage that communication externally, which is why I think Andy Milner will have met with Michael Gove to make sure that our position was clearly understood by Mr Gove at the time. Amey's Central Comms team are responsible for managing the overall Amey reputation, and they would have been working hard to make sure that Amey were appropriately represented through those comms forums. We had concerns about the reputation, therefore, that Amey was getting. We were not in control of any inaccuracies that may have been published about Amey's performance, so that was another area of concern. But our biggest driver was always the potential for a serious safety incident.
Yes.
And that would have been the highest focus of the executive in Amey when engaging in the activities more latterly within the streets program, within the trees program. I think that would have been extremely on the consciousness of the Amey executives at all times to ensure the safety of Amey's workforce and of course members of the public, including campaigners. Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. I mean, that brings me on to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, actually, which you've alluded to a bit in what you've said previously in our discussion, but I wanted to ask you if you could tell me what you've heard about the personal impact on Amey staff of the dispute, and also a bit about the steps the company took to support them. So Amey was very concerned, Mark, as I've said, about the welfare of their people, working on the Streets Ahead project, particularly as many of them lived in the area and had families in the area, children at the local schools, partners, working and living in the area. And of course, the fact the majority of the team on the ground were Sheffield residents. Many of our subcontractors as well, carrying out the works on Amey's behalf, were also local Sheffield people. As an organisation, Amey supports its people. We've got a zero safety code. That's our approach to health and safety, which is indoctrinated throughout all of our workforce. And as senior leaders in the business, we spend an awful lot of our time making sure that the front line feel safe and supported. We don't expect them to do anything that's unsafe. In fact, we tell them to stop if at any point in time they feel unsafe. We expect them to be well equipped, well trained, and we audit that rigorously and engage relentlessly with the workforce at the front line to make sure that that's the case. We have well-being support tools across the organisation as well, Mark, both physical and mental well-being, and those resources have all been made available to our workforce and subcontractors within Sheffield. As with all of our work sites, we carry out risk assessments and detailed method statements before we go to work, and we go to great pains to make sure that our workforce and our subcontractors are protected. The last thing we want as leaders of the business is for anybody not to go home safe and well after a day's work. So, lots of work is done around that. We produced security documentation for our workforce to brief their family on how to keep themselves safe outside of the work environment, how to manage that interaction with the residents and communities of Sheffield, working within Sheffield as they did. So, as you say, a very difficult time for our people. There was a direct impact of the protests on our people and their families, with lots of our staff chose to leave, Mark, unfortunately.
Right.
A number chose to leave, such was the pressure that they felt they were under and the abuse that they received.
Right.
Nobody wants to come to work to be verbally abused and in some instances physically abused. So, and my understanding is really a tough time for a lot of people who fundamentally were only out doing the job that they were employed and paid to do, Mark. So, very difficult time. But I think I'm sure they were well supported with welfare support, with health and safety support and documentation to keep them and their families safe.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, during the course of January, February, early March 2018, there were a series of confrontations, conflagrations, and as I'll discuss with Darren Butt later on, there were a series of pauses that were put in place. I wonder if you can tell me what you have been told about why the pause that was instituted on the 26th of March 2018 was put in place, which is particularly relevant because from that point the tree replacement programme essentially paused until there was a solution and the mediation. But what have you been told about why that decision was taken on the 26th of March 2018?
So my understanding, Mark, is that at Amey's instigation,
yes,
a collective decision was taken to pause the works in order to ensure the safety of our staff, the safety of campaigners and members of the public. None of the previous action taken had been successful, and our escalatory action was being met with an increased level of resistance from campaigners. As a result, Amey felt that there was nothing else that we could do to protect our people on the ground. So we called for a pause with Sheffield City Council, and that was agreed.
Are you aware that the council believed that sometime before that, Amey were willing, at its own expense, to finance a different approach to the trees?
I'm not aware of that, Mark.
Okay.
No.
That's fine. I can ask other people about that. I wanted to move on now, if you could, to ask you if you could explain to us that how, and you touched on this at the beginning of your very helpful introduction to how the finances of the contract work, but I'd like to know a little bit more about how you now expect, and you do now have responsibility in this
I do, yes.
area, the substantial fund that's being built up through the financing of the unitary charge to maintain the condition of the network over the next 15 years, and the approach that you expect to take to street trees as part of the use of that fund and maintaining the network. Could you talk to me a bit about that?
Sure. So in the majority of PFI contracts, the SPV will usually build up a dedicated fund known as a life cycle fund to ensure there is sufficient money to fund the future planned maintenance during the life cycle investment period of the contract. So we do the initial construction period, achieve an acceptable standard for the infrastructure, and then spend the remaining period of the PFI maintaining that through life cycle investment provided for through an allowance from the unitary charge. On this contract, every time Sheffield City Council makes a unitary charge payment during the life cycle period, a portion of that unitary charge is set aside by the SPV, specifically to fund future preventative maintenance, as is our obligation, and also to service the debt accrued during the CIP phase, Mark. So there's a dual role for those funds. The SPV and in turn ALG bear the risk of the life cycle fund being sufficient to meet the replacement obligations. When we hand back at the end of the contract, we have an obligation to hand back at a defined level of quality. So it's the responsibility of the SPV and Amey LG to manage the remaining contract duration through that life cycle fund. On this contract, our forecast is that there will be sufficient funds to deliver the network to the specified condition at the end of the contract, but it's not envisaged that there'll be any surplus available for distribution by either the SPV or ALG. In terms of the life cycle fund, no specific monies are set aside to deal with tree replacement programme per se, but the fund is managed by the SPV on an annual basis, and an allowance will be made to ensure that there are sufficient funds available to maintain the network in accordance with the contract and draw down and pay for works that ALG will need to undertake in accordance with its annual condition requirements. Separate from the life cycle fund, there's an annual maintenance provision to deal with street trees in the future.
My understanding is that the fund for the long-term maintenance of the network is quite substantial. I don't know if you could tell me any more about order of magnitude, scale of resources there, but my understanding is it's a significant part of the unitary charge, which is essentially cycled into to that fund. Could you tell us anything more about the scale of it?
No, I would have to take advice on that. You're talking about the complex financial modelling of the remainder of the life cycle period. I can come back to you on that, Mark, but I don't have those numbers. It would be wrong of me to suggest a number without the detail. I'd
be really grateful if you wouldn't mind checking with people what you can tell me on that, so that I can then just compare it with what other people have told me about what it would be. So thank you.
Understand.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about the approach over the next 15 years you expect to take to the street tree dimension of the programme?
So, I think a lot has been learned from the Streets Ahead programme, Mark, on all sides, and I think with the benefit of hindsight, I'm sure all parties would have done a lot of things differently, and we've covered an awful lot of that. I think what's important to Amey is that we move forward with the Sheffield Street Tree Partnership, and we move forward with Sheffield City Council, in an appropriate way that ensures that the needs and demands of the network are met in terms of the quality of the street scene, of the highway and the footway, which we have an obligation to maintain, but also that we can balance that with the need to protect the healthy and the right mix of trees within the tree scene for the future of Sheffield residents. I think that's important to Amey, but above all, to come out from this process and all take the lessons and move forward together. We have a job to do, we have targets to meet. I touched on earlier how intense that can be from time to time. I'm very keen to make sure that the Sheffield contract delivers for the residents and people of Sheffield. I'm passionate about our service delivery meets the requirements of Sheffield City Council. We have a strong relationship. I have a strong relationship with the senior leaders in Sheffield, and I'm pleased for that. And I think deliver for the employees that we have on the ground, the 500 people I talked about in my opening statement, Mark. Make sure that they have a future,
right,
with the Streets Ahead programme for the duration of the contract.
Okay, so would it be fair for me to conclude from what you've just said that, and from what you've said during the course of our discussion, that you recognise that the dispute was a serious problem, that you are trying to learn lessons from what happened, that the dispute caused harm to people, including staff who you were employing at the time, some of whom you continue to employ, and that you have some responsibilities, not just because you have a contract for the next 15 years, but because of your wider values as a company, to try to make sure that the way things move forward in future doesn't just avoid a repeat of the problems that emerged, but does better in terms of the reasons why the dispute emerged, in particular to do with the street tree dimension of the contract. Would that be a reasonable thing for me to understand as part of the thrust of what you've said?
Yeah, and look, over the lifetime of the contract, the challenges on the contract will change. We haven't really touched on the sustainability agenda, on the climate emergency that many local authorities have declared, Mark. So, we need to understand, I think all better understand the role that the tree scene can play in a sustainable future for Sheffield. And I think I will reflect on the fact that we still have 15 years to run on the contract. I do think we need flexibility in that contract to meet the demands of the future, that we all have. And I think clearly trees will play an increasingly important part in that, which is an interesting development of people's thought process as a result of the demands of net zero, the carbon agenda, and sustainability, and the role that the trees play in that.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. I think that's helpful. Do you have any other concerns for the future of the contract up to 2037? Any other things playing on your mind that... I ask this from the perspective of the bit of my terms of reference, which is to try to contribute to an avoidance of any future problems emerging. Is there anything else on your mind that could be problematic?
I think I would hope we all learn lessons from going through this exercise, Mark, and I think the leadership teams in all of the organisations heed those lessons and look to move forward in perhaps a more flexible manner to recognise the changing demands on the delivery of the service. We haven't touched on the need for recycling, lower carbon materials in surfacing solutions, the impact of climate change on the infrastructure. We're seeing warmer winters, that means heavier rainfall, more flooding, so there are different demands and needs on the infrastructure than there were at the start of the framework. So I think it's a hope that we can, the flexibility that we've seen from the point at which we ceased the tree activity to the point we are now going forward. I would hope that we can build on that, on the need to have a flexible approach, given the restrictions that we've already talked about within the PFI model mark and the 752 KPIs that we've got to conform with. I think that would be a hope that together we can move forward SPV, Amey LG and Sheffield City Council, and indeed the residents in a more flexible way.
Yeah, and indeed there have been this whole sequence, half a dozen I think, of variations to the original contract. Yeah. So it's, what you've just described is feasible within the construct.
Yes. Maturities.
Do you what is your view on the Street Tree partnership?
I think the Street Tree partnership has received very positive feedback from all stakeholders and Sheffield City Council, and it's fostered a much better communication between the stakeholders. We think it's been successful because it's got a transparent strategy, namely to ensure that the street trees are well maintained, they're cared for, and that they are resistant to the threats of disease and climate change, so that they can deliver benefits for people and the environment and the environment of Sheffield. There is a decision matrix around tree replacement and consultation led by Sheffield City Council. No decisions are taken without collaboration in that forum. And the aims of the strategy document that's been helped to foster much more trust and openness, Mark, I think, amongst the stakeholders. However, the decisions may not help to deliver the long-term outcomes that was originally contemplated for the Streets Ahead programme. They're in some ways, they're a sense of a temporary solution. Mm-hmm. But the forum has allowed progress to be made and has had a positive effect. On the back of the Street Tree Partnership and the overarching management plan, Sheffield gained accreditation from the programme for the endorsement of forest certification under the UK Woodland Assurance Standard, managing trees outside of the forest standard, making Sheffield the first city in the UK, in fact, to achieve that accreditation. So that's a tremendous turnaround and a tremendous endorsement of the Street Tree Partnership. The accreditation, which involves Amey's tree replacement programme being audited externally, really symbolises that, I think, Mark, the positive progress that we've made with Sheffield street trees, and something I think to be celebrated.
Okay, good. No, thank you very much. It's also the case, though, that there are some parts of the programme which weren't the infrastructure upgrading. I'm thinking, for example, of Sheldon Road and one or two other places which haven't been addressed yet under the contract, and the state of some of those roads is not fantastic. I don't think it's controversial to say that. I just wonder how you see the role of the Street Tree Partnership in contributing to finding ways forward for some of those remaining things that probably really do need to be addressed.
So I would think the very positive engagement that we have together with the partnership should be taken forward, and I would encourage full engagement on adopting the right solutions for the streets that you've referred to. We need to improve accessibility of the pavement network. We need to manage the tree stocks effectively, and I'm sure we can come up jointly with appropriate engineering solutions, Mark, that meet the expectations of the contract and our ability to deliver against the KPIs, but also be sensitive to the protection of the tree scene within those environments. I'm not familiar directly with those streets, but my expectation is that we can find a solution together to fix those problems.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm extremely grateful to you for everything you've said. You've clearly done lots of preparation and no doubt had some help with that. But let me just finally give you a chance to summarise what you think, with the benefit of hindsight, could have been done differently, and by whom and when.
So I've probably covered most of these points, but if I may, in summary, Mark, I think a more flexible approach in relation to the specification and the payment mechanism and the penalty regime, and I referred to that a number of times. So that's a more flexible approach by Sheffield, although I appreciate that they are and were in a very difficult situation in terms of their obligations to central government, in terms of the risk transfer under the contract, in terms of the risk to losing PFI credits and the way that mechanism works and how that flows down through the SPV and ultimately to Amey. So a very complex contract with very high standards, which the people of Sheffield deserve, and my business Amey are keen to deliver against. So I think a more flexible approach, and we've spoken about how I'd like to see that going forward. I think a more integrated comms strategy would have been better. Amey have got lots of experience of dealing with members of the public. I refer to the number of letters and public exhibitions that we've held across the city of Sheffield. Our people are from Sheffield, they're of the Sheffield area. They've got lots of experience in selling the values of the street tree programme, and I think in truth we probably missed an opportunity to engage at that level with the Amey expertise. So I think that would be a lesson, and I think the protester risk, if we had our time again and we'd have foreseen the protester risk, I think Amey may have handled that differently. Under the contract we would have not taken that protester risk on under clause 19 if we'd have had any inclination, Mark, that the challenge that would bring, and our intention with that was that would have potentially given us relief from penalty as a result of protester action directly associated with our works. And the difference there is potentially we could have got commercial relief from penalties, which may well have put a different perspective on the situation that Amey found themselves in at the time. So I think that's a lesson that we would learn from the contract. And finally, I think with the benefit of hindsight, in the heat of the moment, in real time, perhaps Amey could have pushed back a bit harder, I think at the time, against the escalatory measures, and we've talked about reasonable force. I think if we had our time again as Amey, I think we'd have pushed back a lot harder, a lot sooner against that level of escalation, and we'd have pushed back against Sheffield and against the SPV and against the shareholders in the agreement. We'd have done that sooner, and we'd have look afresh at the engineering solutions that were potentially available to us, and the funding mechanisms perhaps for some of those engineering solutions.
Thank you. I think the last point you made is actually an extremely important point. So thank you for summarising it and flagging it in the way you've done, and I'll reflect carefully on precisely what you've said. I do think you've put that in a rather clear way, so thank you very much indeed. Yeah. I just want to check one small point on an earlier point you made there, which is just to check that you recognise there's a distinction between engagement, which is about describing to people and residents what you're going to do, and engagement, which is about giving people a chance to comment on and then reacting to and possibly adjusting what you're going to do. Do you see that? What you're talking about? You're talking about being ready to do the latter, not just the former. Would that be fair?
The distinction I would make is between communication and engagement.
Right.
So communication would be telling residents, we're coming into your street on this date to do this work.
Right.
That's not an engagement. That is a notification,
right,
if you like. So that's an approach.
Right.
An engagement approach is much more the latter that you've described, which is engaging with residents, talking to them about the programme, the importance of the programme, how the decisions are made, engaging them in the decision process, and understanding their concerns, and trying to manage and deal with their concerns in a sensitive way, but at the same time deliver on our obligations. And it's a very fine balance.
It's a fine balance, but it does involve being willing to contemplate adjusting what you do in the light of what you've heard. It does.
It does
very
indeed.
Good. Thank you very much. That's very clear. Is there anything else you'd like to say that you've not had a chance to say yet? There's something you're going to write to me on in a bit more detail, so I'm not asking you to rehash that. But is there anything else that you'd like to say?
Just in terms of some closing remarks, if I may,
Please.
Mark. Amey are very proud of our work in Sheffield, and have worked in the city for over 40 years. The street scene in Sheffield has dramatically improved under the Streets Ahead contract, and the work we have done will mean that the street scene is in good shape for generations to come. Within the constraints of the contract, we've always tried to offer and deliver the best solutions to the council and to the people of Sheffield. Most of our employees on this contract live in and around the city, so it's fair to say that as a business we are properly invested in Sheffield, and it really matters to all of us to deliver a great service through the contract. Our team on the ground were always closely engaged with the concerns of residents, and we work with the council wherever possible to deliver solutions to the satisfaction of all stakeholders. At Amey, putting people first is one of our core values, and we strongly believe that health, safety and well-being of our teams, clients and those around us should take priority over everything else. We take our health and safety duties extremely seriously to protect our people and the general public from any potential harm. When this contract was first envisaged, climate change was not a key feature of decision making like it is now. Looking forward, Amey is committed to tackling the effects of climate change on all of our contracts, and I'm committed to working with Sheffield City Council to improve the contract's climate change credentials. Our relationship with Sheffield City Council has always been strong, and our relationship with all stakeholders has grown and matured as a result of our shared experiences throughout this difficult period. Looking forward, our membership of the Street Tree Partnership means we are working collaboratively to deliver benefits for the people of Sheffield and for the environment.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very helpful summation of your position going forward. Thank you. And thank you again for being so comprehensive and straightforward and candid in answering my questions. I really appreciate it. That concludes the hearing, Charles. You can